Glad I'm not the only one feeling the effects of fall in the air this morning with the throat clearing. And, fall's one of the best seasons of the year, but it does come with some downside. As we continue in Acts this morning, imagine being asked to explain why you believe the very thing you believe. Not in a church like this, not surrounded by people who already agree with you, but in a room filled with people who have power, influence, education, and they're there to question everything you say. That's the position Paul finds himself in, and if we're honest, that's really the position that we've been looking at Paul in for the last few chapters now. But in 26 specifically, he's standing before a king, a governor, military commanders, and some of the most prominent people in the region. And when we come to 26 this morning, Paul has the floor before all of these people. And if there was ever a moment in life to choose your words carefully, for him to choose what he's going to say very thoughtfully, this was it. Now, if you're Paul, you could focus on maybe proving your innocence, or attacking the people who falsely accuse you, or maybe you plead for sympathy after spending 2 years under house arrest. But Paul does something different, and it shouldn't surprise us because he's been doing this with every trial or hearing he's been in so far. He uses this as an opportunity to talk about Christ. He tells Agrippa that the hope that Israel has, the hope that Israel has been waiting for, is fulfilled in Jesus. He even admits that he once hated Jesus and persecuted the people who believed that. And then he explains why and how he spent his life proclaiming the very message he once tried to destroy, all because he encountered, according to him, this risen Christ, this risen Jesus. And Paul may be standing before King Agrippa, but ultimately he's not explaining himself to the king. He's simply sharing his testimony with the king. See, today as we look at Acts 26, what we're going to realize is it's really about what becomes of a person when they become convinced that Jesus Christ is actually alive. Because here's the truth. If Jesus is alive, Christianity cannot and is not something we simply agree with. If Jesus Christ truly is alive and we believe that, it changes where we place our hope. It changes the people we are becoming. And it changes what we live our lives as the goal, as the thing we're seeking to accomplish. And that's exactly what we see in Paul's testimony this morning. Because as he gives his defense, as he starts talking to the king and to the crowd, the question that is hanging over everyone in the room, and if we're honest, us this morning, is that if Jesus is really alive, what does he demand? What does he request? What does he expect from our life? And here's what we're going to see this morning. This is the big idea, that an encounter with the risen Christ transforms what we believe, who we are, and what we live for. If we truly have this encounter, this experience where we are brought from darkness into life, where we are freed from the slavery of our sin and put, as Scripture calls it, in the marvelous light of God, then everything about our existence should change, not when we get to heaven, but in the here and now. And if you recall last week, Paul has been in prison for 2 years, and King Agrippa arrives to town with Bernice, and they've been updated on what's happening with Paul, and Agrippa decides he wants to give Paul a chance to speak. And it's important as we start to look at 26, in this moment, Paul isn't on trial. This isn't some of the court hearings that we have already seen. King Agrippa simply wants to hear from him to see if he should stand trial for these charges that are being brought against him. And as 26 opens this morning, the first thing we're going to see is that our hope is found in the risen Christ. Because what Paul does in these opening verses is he argues that faith in Jesus actually isn't the abandonment of Israel's hope, but Jesus' resurrection is the fulfillment of that hope. Look at what it says in verse 1. It says, "So Agrippa said to Paul, 'You have permission to speak for yourself.' Then Paul stretched out his hand and made his defense. And Paul, beginning his defense, says, 'I consider myself fortunate before you, King Agrippa. I'm going to make my defense today against all the Jews and all the accusations of the Jews, especially because you are familiar with the customs of the Jews and the controversies of the Jews. Therefore, I beg you, listen to me patiently, O king.'" See, just as Paul did with Felix and the other rulers of Rome before him, he starts by acknowledging the king and simply thanking him for the opportunity to hear him out. And what's interesting here is he doesn't just thank the king for being the king or overseeing the project. He says, "I thank you because unlike some of the people I've spoken to, you actually understand the Jewish people. You know their customs, and you know the controversies that have occurred under the rule of Rome. So the things I'm about to tell you, the things I'm about to talk to you about, they aren't foreign to you. These aren't stories to you. You actually know the Jewish people really well. And because you know us so well, I'm simply asking that you bear with me while I explain what they are saying against me." And then he goes on to start to explain what charges are brought against him and why. And in verse 4 he says, "My manner of life from my youth, spent from the beginning among my own nation in Jerusalem, is known by all the Jews." And what Luke doesn't do right here is he doesn't unpack that history, because if you've been following along with us in Acts, or if you've read Acts, you know that Paul has already talked about his past extensively. So Luke doesn't really feel the need to rehash that, but just to rehash it for us, we know that Paul was born into a good family, that he was born of the tribe of Benjamin. He trained under the best Jewish teachers. He was one of the most respected Pharisees. He had enormous zeal for God. And this is known to all of the Jews in Jerusalem. This is known to the very people who are accusing him. And more importantly, the very people who are accusing him, they don't know of Paul. They know him and his family really well. So they're not accusing a stranger of stories they heard. They're accusing a man they watched grow up from a child. This is the argument he's making before them. Which is why he says in verse 5, they have known for a long time, if they are willing to testify, if they're willing to come before you and tell you, they know that what I am saying is true. They know my history, they know my past, they know my upbringing. That according to the strictest party of our religion, I lived as a Pharisee. And just to be clear here, the strictest party of their religion simply was the Pharisees. There's no secret sect he's talking about. There's no secret religion within Judaism that we're talking about. The Pharisees were the strictest among the Jewish people, and they were known especially for their rigorous observance and the interpretation of Jewish laws and traditions. So he's essentially saying, look, they know. And if they're willing to come before you right now, they can tell you that I was one of the most adherent Jewish believers of our people. They know me. They know this to be true. And now, King Agrippa, I stand here on trial because of my hope in the promise made by God to our fathers. This shouldn't sound new to us because, again, we've watched Paul on trial for a few chapters here, and every time he makes the same argument that this God that he worships, this God that he has given his life to, is the very same God of Abraham. It is the same God of their ancestors. It is the Jewish God. He did not turn from Yahweh. He did not turn from the Jewish faith. In fact, in what can only be described as incredibly ironic, Paul is on trial because of his hope in Yahweh, because his belief that Yahweh has fulfilled the promises he gave his people. So he's essentially saying to the king, I'm still Jewish. I still worship the Jewish God. And the fact that I worship him is why I am on trial before you this very moment. Which is why he goes on to say, to which the 12 tribes hope to obtain, as they earnestly worship night and day. And for the hope I am accused by Jews, O king. And I don't want us to miss this here, because it's really easy to just skip over this because it seems kind of simple and normal, and for the most part it is simple, but Paul is saying, look, I have the same hope the Jewish people have. They hope that they're going to live in peace and harmony forever one day because of a Messiah. And he's simply saying that this hope that the Jews have is realized in Christ. That this is what the Jews are missing. This is what he's on trial for. Not because he forsake his faith, not because he forsook Yahweh, but because he declared Jesus as God and the fulfillment of the hope that Jews hope to obtain. And then he poses this question in 8, and it should cause us all to stop and think, because he says, why is it thought incredible by any of you, and when he says you here, he's referring to the Jewish people, not Rome, that God raises the dead? Now remember who's accusing him here and who is in front of him. Yes, there are Roman officials, but we have the high priest, we have Pharisees and Jewish people. And the Jewish people believed in the resurrection. They didn't question Paul on the resurrection. The Pharisees and the Jews, for the most part, believed a resurrection would take place, but they refused to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And Paul is simply challenging them in this moment. If you believe that the resurrection is real, put your money where your mouth is. Because I'm not questioning the resurrection, you are. We both say we believe in the resurrection. I'm the only one who's saying, yes, it's true. See, they believe God can raise the dead, and they will, but now they want Paul killed for declaring the exact same thing they believe. And it shouldn't come as a surprise, because when Adam and Eve sinned and sin entered the world and everything fell apart in Genesis 3, and God gives that promise that one day I'm going to send a seed, I'm going to send someone to fix everything that you broke. He says that the snake would strike the heel of the seed and that the seed would crush the head of the serpent, and we see this playing out here in this passage. Where Jesus came to earth, he lived a perfect life. He fulfilled the law perfectly. He did what we could never do to give us a gift we can't even dream of deserving. And going to the cross, taking our place, he dies. He rises from the dead, offering hope in anyone who believes and confesses in him. And Paul is simply saying, I believe that God raises the dead. Do you? Because if you do, it will change everything. If you do, I won't be on trial, because you will understand that Jesus is the fulfillment of the promise that he gave us so long ago. See, the charges against Paul aren't based off the resurrection. They're based off who will God raise from the dead. And it's important for us to understand it, and I know it may sound simple and common because we hear it over and over again. But Jesus and his resurrection is the fulfillment of God's promise and the foundation of our hope. Paul actually says in his letters, he says, if Jesus didn't raise from the dead, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. If Jesus didn't raise from the dead, then we are simply foolish people, and you should pity us and despise us. The resurrection is the foundation of our hope, and if that didn't happen, nothing else we believe is true, and the world should pity us. And as followers of Christ, and I want this to be true for myself, more true every day and true for us, we need to trust and treasure the risen Jesus, rather than placing our hope in the temporary things this world offers. And make no mistake about it, the world is offering you hope in everything but Jesus every single day of your life. But because of the resurrection, because we know that's true, we need to live with confidence in God's promise, especially when circumstances give you reason to lose hope. And if anyone had reason to lose hope, it's Paul, because he's 2 years into persecution right now with no sight and end. And his confidence hasn't diminished, it has only grown. And the reason for that, we're going to see as this passage continues to unfold, is because our lives are changed by the risen Christ. See, the resurrection of Jesus wasn't some abstract thought, wasn't some theory. Paul knew that Jesus rose from the dead. There was no doubt in his mind. There was no question of the authenticity of a risen Jesus, and it changed everything. A man who once violently opposed Jesus is now personally being persecuted because he is declaring that this man has risen from the dead. Look at what it says in verse 9. He makes no excuses for himself, something I think we're really good at as a people. I myself was convinced that I should do many things opposing the name of Jesus of Nazareth. And I did so in Jerusalem. I not only locked up many of the saints in prison after receiving authority from the chief priests. By the way, the very system, the very chief priests that are now trying to have him killed, he had authority from once. But when they were put to death, the believers, I cast my vote against them. See, Paul isn't talking as someone who was born into the faith or being raised to believe in Jesus from an early childhood like Timothy, or even someone who was open to the idea of Jesus being Messiah. Paul is talking to them as a man who understands why people would oppose Jesus. He understands why they would deny him and want nothing to do with the church. He was so opposed to Jesus and openly against it that he went to extremes to stop it. We know Stephen was killed at his feet. We know that he was arresting people. He's admitting it here. We know that the chief priest gave him authority. We know that he was happy to see Christians killed. And look at what he says in verse 10. And I personally punished them often in the synagogues and tried to make them blaspheme. And in raging fury against them, I persecuted them even in foreign cities. See, we thought prison and death was the worst Paul could do, but he was so much worse than torturing and killing Christians because it wasn't enough for them to die. He wanted them to reject Jesus altogether. It wasn't enough for them to be thrown in prison. It wasn't enough for them to be tortured. He would only be satisfied when they blasphemed, when they rejected God himself. And he did it under the same authority that is now trying to condemn him. Paul, by his own admission, was a horrible person trying to commit genocide against the people of God. And the very same thing he's guilty of doing to believers 30 years ago, everywhere he went, he is now being accused of himself. He is now being put to death for the very thing he put people to death for. And look at what he continues to tell Agrippa. He says, in connection to this persecution, in connection to this desire to get people to turn away from Jesus, I journeyed to Damascus with authority and commission of the high chief priest. He's essentially saying, look, my zeal and my love for God and my hate for this man named Jesus took me to Damascus. And here's what he didn't expect, and I know this is familiar to us because we've already seen it a few times in Acts. On the road to Damascus, everything changed for this man. He thought he was going to continue doing what he was doing, and everything gets flipped upside down. Look at what he tells Agrippa. At about midday, O king, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, that shone around me and those who journeyed with us, or with me. He's essentially saying, look, everything changed when I was on my way to Damascus. And it's easy for us to just move past this moment because it's the third time we've seen it now in Acts. And if you've been a Christian for a long time, you know this story well of his conversion. But this is incredibly important, not just for Saul, but for us as well. A moment where Paul goes from persecutor to persecuted, where he changes from being a man who made people suffer for Christ to one who would suffer for him personally. The man who would go on to plant more churches than we can imagine, who took the gospel further than anyone else at the time. The man who God would use to write most of the New Testament is traveling to Damascus to kill believers and has this incredible encounter with Jesus. Look at what he says in verse 14. And when we had fallen to the ground. And to be clear, when the sun engulfs you in light, falling to the ground is probably pretty normal, right? He was blinded by the light. He was surrounded by sun. He falls to the ground and he said, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. Don't miss what happened here. A voice is speaking to him in Hebrew, and essentially what he hears is Saul, Saul, lama ata rodafini. Why are you persecuting me? And this is crucial because remember, he's before Rome, being accused by Jews, saying that he still worships Yahweh. The voice he heard wasn't a foreign language. The voice he heard wasn't from the Roman gods. The voice he heard was from his own God speaking in his native tongue. It was the language of the Jews. It was the people of God. And he's telling Agrippa and everyone listening that this encounter with the risen Jesus wasn't foreign, it wasn't pagan, it was uniquely Jewish by design. He hears Jesus speak in the language he heard his entire life. And Paul said, "Who are you, Lord?" And the Lord said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." I know you hear this all the time up here, but no one is beyond saving and the transforming power of Jesus Christ. It's easy for us to look at people and think that God is never going to get a hold of their hearts, that they are too far gone, that they have done too much, that they are too hardened to ever accept Jesus. And if that was ever true about anyone, it would have been true of Paul. And yet on the road to Damascus, Jesus opens his eyes, reveals himself as the risen Christ, and it changes everything for Paul. And the reality is 2,000 years later, Jesus is still doing that every single day on this planet. It is the reason that he calls us to be on mission. It is the reason that he leaves us here as his witnesses, as his disciples, as his people. Because Jesus is not done. He is still changing lives, even the lives of those we think will never come to faith. And if we're honest as people of God, and I know I am guilty of this, so I'm not attacking you, I am talking about myself first and foremost, we need to repent of the ways we resist Jesus. Because Jesus didn't die so he could have our Sundays or our community groups. He died so that he could have our lives and change them completely. And I think sometimes as Christians, we're scared to talk about Jesus and what he's done in our life because what if no one believes us? What if What if they reject us? What if they hate us? Right? We already know that the number one reason people don't talk about Christ is fear of rejection. But we need to let the change that Jesus has made in our life become part of our testimonies to others. Because here's the reality. One of the most powerful things God has given his people to share Jesus with the world is what Jesus has done in their lives. Because it moves the gospel from theory to practical. It tells people, look, I understand, which is what Paul's doing here. I understand why you didn't want Jesus. I understand why you rejected him. I understand why you hated him. But I'm here to tell you what he did in my life and how that changed everything. And Paul, standing before the Roman rulers, standing before the Jewish rulers, standing before the people of God, is declaring that my life changed the moment I knew Jesus was risen. And that testimony has been the thing that has fueled his missionary work for 30 years. Which is interesting because in the last few verses we see that our mission is given by the risen Christ. We don't need to go to Matthew 28 to look at the mission. We were just talking on Friday night in Romans with the youth group where Paul says, how are they going to hear if no one has told them? And how will they know if no one has preached? And who will send them? Ladies and gentlemen, if you believe and call on the name of Christ, make no mistake about it, every single disciple, every single believer is given the mission by the risen Christ. There is no one exempt from mission. You may not be a preacher, you may not go into ministry full time, but you will always be on mission full time. From the moment you wake up and put your feet on the ground, Jesus says, you belong to me, my life, your life is purposed for me, and I desire to use you for mission wherever you are. Look at what it says in verse 16. But Jesus now says to Paul, rise up and stand on your feet. For I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you as a servant and a witness to the things which you have seen me and in those which I will appear to you. Make no mistake about it, Jesus is God. When he appeared to Saul, who later becomes Paul, he could have appeared to him to stop him. He could have appeared to him to kill him and strike him down with judgment as he would be right in doing as God for Saul, who is killing the Christian believers. But he doesn't appear to Paul to harm him. Instead, he appears and repurposes his life and to use him in ways he couldn't even begin to imagine. If you would have even asked Paul after this moment in Damascus, after Ananias raises his eyes or heals his eyes, what is God going to do through your life? He would never have imagined 30 years later he would have done all he did and ended up in the moment he is in. He would have told you, I don't deserve any of that. I am the chief sinner among sinners. I am the most guilty among anyone. And because Jesus repurposes his life, a man who once tried to stop Jesus now becomes his servant and becomes one of his most bold, most adherent, most fearless witnesses in all the world, telling everyone what he has heard and seen. And honestly, that's why the apostles and Paul stress that so much. If you read his letters, if you read the letters from the other apostles, they're constantly stressing, we are not special. We are simply telling you the things we have witnessed, the things we have seen, the things we know to be true. And God isn't done there because Jesus isn't just saving him to be a servant and a witness. Look at what he says. He says, delivering you from your people, the Jews, and from the Gentiles who I am sending you to open their eyes, so that they may turn from darkness to light, so that they may be taken from the power of Satan and given to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and be placed among those who are sanctified in faith in me. it's really interesting here because he doesn't promise that everything's going to be okay for Paul. He doesn't promise he's never going to get hurt. He's never going to get injured. We know at this point in his life, he has battle scars among battle scars. He has been left for dead. He has been beaten. He has experienced some of the worst this world offers and has continued to proclaim the name of Christ. But what God promises is, for Paul, I am going to keep you alive. No matter what you go through, know that I am going to keep you alive so that people around the world will come to faith in me when their eyes are open to the reality of Jesus Christ. So that they would be pulled out of slavery, that's what this darkness is, slavery to sin, and placed, as I've already said this morning, in God's marvelous light, grafted into